You know, and actually I would say if we can mute that, your mic, that way we don't get any feedback, and then we're all set.
Perfect.
Perfect. And let me make sure that I can show my screen here. Excellent. Alrighty, so if I can get just a thumbs up, do you guys see the screen? Perfect. Excellent. So this is really about unpacking TPACK and kind of understanding a little bit more about the context, the framework, and then being able to apply it back into a classroom. So my name is Mark FIjor, and I'm the technology coordinator at the Cove School. We're a K-12 school for students with learning disability. So before that, I was a technology facilitator in a district, K-8 district, for 6 years. So kind of run the whole gamut here, and I think there's a piece of this framework for everybody. At the bottom of my presentation slide, there is my Twitter handle. If you have comments, questions, or sometimes just a good laugh, you're free to follow. It's at New School Tech, so feel free to follow along if you'd like. So I always like to start this kind of presentation or talk with an analogy. I think it helps set the stage and helps kind of give an understanding of maybe what the problem is or a problem that we face. So if we look at this picture and we say the objective here is, if I asked you to hang this picture, hang this picture on a wall, which tool would you choose? So you have the hammer, you have the saw, and you have another power tool. And so which tool would be the most appropriate? Now, hopefully most people would pick the hammer and the nail, unless you're really a do-it-yourself enthusiast, you might choose something different, but most people would pick the hammer and nail, with the reality that you have very limited knowledge of the hammer and nail. You never went to a professional development for the hammer and nail, but you just kind of instinctively knew that that would be the tool based on a limited amount of knowledge and specifically focused on that objective. And so that helps to kind of determine what tool is the most appropriate. But in education, sometimes we come at it this way. We start with the tool first and then say, what can I use this on? And it's not necessarily the teacher's fault or a principal. I mean, the reality is there's so many devices coming down. There's so many different initiatives. There's so many expectations to use technology that it's easy to fall in this trap of saying, I have a tool, what can I use this? How do I fit it into my class? And so today we'll kind of take a step back at really looking at what's that process for understanding how do you select the right tool to meet your objectives. So we start by the idea of starting with the tool first is really this concept of tool-centric thinking. Again, I want kids to be able to create a Prezi or make a blog or make videos. And those are good activities. But if we start with the thinking there, it kind of limits what we can do, and it limits how effective the technology can be in terms of the student learning. So we really want to make that shift, because also it's impossible to keep up with these tools. They keep changing. So if we were always that tool-centric thinking, our heads would be spinning and we never have any focus and we'd be all over the place. So the point of this presentation today is to use TPACK to really shift to this objective-focused integration. That it's not just about making videos, it's about using that video to demonstrate understanding or mastery of a concept, or being able to assess it against the objective or enhance the objective. So keep that in mind as we kind of walk through TPACK, and what it means is how we really get to this objective focused integration, rather than just saying, I have this, how do I use it here? So again, how do we get there? Well, enter TPACK, and TPACK is a framework out of Michigan State. It's been around for almost 10 years now. And it's based on this idea that for teacher knowledge, so Schulman's idea of this kind of new construct of knowledge, this pedagogical content knowledge, that in order to be a teacher, that you would have to have the knowledge not just about math, but that you would have to know how to teach math. And that by combining those two kind of domains, you create this subdomain of pedagogical content knowledge. And so what Kohler and Mishra decided to look at was, well, what happens when you add technology to the mix? How does that change not just the pedagogy, not just the content, but how does that really overlap with those? And what happens when you do that? And so that's really what TPACK is. It's that understanding of the intersection of technology, pedagogy, and content, and really the knowledge and skills needed to be able to apply those. And here they are. So we have these intersections and overlaps here. So when you put technology together with pedagogy, it creates this kind of subdomain, the technological pedagogical content knowledge. You also have your PCK, your pedagogical content knowledge, and then your technical content knowledge, technological content knowledge. And we'll talk about what that means. And having knowledge in each of these domains and understanding those intersections are really crucial to successful integration of technology, where you're not just using the tool, you're really understanding how it's going to impact kids and how it impacts the learning. So TPACK essentially, in a short story, provides that teachers with that framework that really emphasizes the role of the teacher as a decision maker. It's not saying you have to use X with Y. It's saying you know your kids, you know your content, you know your teaching, and it lets you kind of be the decision maker in that process with the understanding of how the technology will be used to support the learning. So to kind of break it down a little bit more, when we look at those domains, so if we look at content, content is really your what. It's math, your science, your social studies, possibly executive functioning skills. It's the what you want kids to learn. When you add the technology, it's really those tools that allow us to do that. So you can say textbooks are technology. Whiteboards would also be forms of technology. These are tools that you can use to help enhance the learning process or change the way the content is delivered. And you can get it as high tech up to iPads and Apple Watches. Who knows? You could get pretty crazy there. But what happens when you put those two together? What happens when you use those technological tools to really enhance the content? Whoops. So what's interesting, especially about content, is that technology really changes content in complex ways. That if you're looking at just in terms of writing and storytelling, what technology's been able to do to really enhance the type of stories, the type of writing, communication has been done is really incredible. And that's true in that could be potentially true in any area as you look at math and look at science and social studies. Certainly the technology has allowed us to really change the content. So that's one way in terms of integrating those tools that technology can be used, that it really does kind of shift that content and open up new ways of accessing and exploring the content. And the knowledge about those intersections, how those tools change the content, would fall into that technological content knowledge. So understanding the role of calculators in math, or understanding the role of some of the technology pieces in science would be your technological content knowledge. If you look at more of the pedagogy, that's the how. That's how you're teaching and how kids are learning. So just some different examples: direct instruction, whole group instruction, and then the technology tools as instructional tools that students will either use to create or for the learning process or to demonstrate their understanding. Again, when we put those together, that becomes your TPK, understanding how to teach with tools and understanding how kids can learn with tools really become that technological pedagogical content knowledge. Specifically, how does technology change the way we teach, and how does technology change the way kids learn? The big question that we always ask is, as we're looking at integrating technology, we say, what do we want the learning to look like? And that really helps us shape out how we choose tools and how we make decisions. What do we want it to look like? You walk into a room, what should the learning look like? Are they are they working collaboratively? Is there an end product or an end process that will be used to demonstrate that understanding? These are important questions when we're looking at how we can use technology effectively. A good example of that shift is this concept of blended learning. So you've heard about flipped classroom or some of these concepts. The idea being that we're really taking that face-to-face instruction and that virtual instruction. So traditional, maybe some of those traditional teaching strategies versus the adding of technology and getting to these really new, crazy ways of learning, these virtual ways of learning. And then that in-between stage of really combining those two pieces. I think having an understanding of the blended learning is a really good kind of example of where that TPACK piece fits. How do you determine when to do something face-to-face as opposed to completely virtual or completely or more that blended where it's a little bit of both. And that's determined by not only the content and the objectives, it may also be determined by access too. And you have to think about, well, what would it look like if I only had one computer in a room versus one-to-one? And you have to make those decisions too. So again, that TPACK and these questions are hopefully giving you the ability to make those decisions. The last piece is this idea of context. So the blue line around the TPACK bubbles is really about that context. And basically what that means is that TPACK for us or TPACK for you may look very different than TPACK for me. That it shouldn't be so rigid as to say, no, this is the only technological, pedagogical content knowledge that exists. The reality is we all work in different contexts, whether it be culturally, whether it be grade level, whether it be the types of kids that we service. So in my world, in a special ed setting, my context is very, very different. The content that they're learning is different. The strategies that we use are different. Some of the tools that we use are different than what might be in a typical fourth grade classroom. So it's important to know and not be rigid in saying, well, there's only one way. That it's important to look at this and say, in the context that you're working, what would that look like? And understanding that it may look very different for somebody else. In between is what we call the sweet spot. And so in terms of that, using those different domains of knowledge is that essentially we get to a place where all three are intersecting. So the sweet spot where all three intersect kind of helps us design those lessons. So from a teacher perspective, when you can balance all three of those pieces and have an understanding that it's really designed to help you design those lessons, activities that maximize each of those domains. From an administrative side, we look at it as a way to really develop professional learning experiences. So for example, we may look to evaluate where people are on certain areas. So for example, we're doing a lot with STEM, but we've recognized that our teachers really don't have the content knowledge. They know how to use the tools and they know good teaching, but we kind of pulled back and said, we really have to beef up our technological content knowledge in order to be successful. That's a gap we have. So we use it to kind of gauge our professional development. And then we also look to really influence our strategic decision making too. TPACK can be used to kind of frame out some of those decisions where, are we making a choice because IT says this is what we have to have? Or are we really balancing all of those three things? And so that's something that we do as at our tech department. We really look at each of those domains and making sure that we address them in any purchase that we make. So we already talked about context, and we'll move on to really the important part of what knowledge do you actually have to be successful? What knowledge do you absolutely need? We have a saying that we don't want teachers to be experts in technology. We don't need them to be experts in technology. We want them to be experts in good teaching. We want them to know the content that they're teaching and how to teach it. But in terms of balancing our time and knowledge, we don't want them to be experts. But we do want them to have some foundational knowledge in terms of that technology and some of the foundational knowledge and the technological, pedagogical content knowledge. So again, it's important that you don't have to be an expert in technology. What you probably need to know is a general understanding of what the device does, how to undo, how to get out of a mistake that a kid makes, and how to share. And if you can figure out those three things, generally you're going to be pretty successful with your implementation because kids are going to figure it out. As long as you have the strategies down and you know the teaching that you're doing and know what the end result should be, the kids may figure out some of those other pieces, but the amount of knowledge that you need to get started using something shouldn't be that great, or you shouldn't feel the pressure to necessarily be an expert. So if we talk about TPACK actually in action in terms of designing and implementing lessons, if we looked at that technocentric approach again, it's really that idea of you have a tool, you find an activity, you align it to an objective or standard. Everybody, we've all been there. It happens. Sometimes you just want to try something, or sometimes you kind of have to go backwards. But the goal would be to get to that second level of saying, if you put your objective first, then decide your activity, that backwards design. Now you're applying the tool. And most importantly, you're evaluating the tool. Because if the difference between the top approach and the bottom approach is you have no opportunity for evaluation. You've already decided what tool you're using in the technocentric approach, and that's it. Whereas in the second model, you're really having that opportunity to say, is this the right tool? And what do I need to consider about using it? So let's talk a little bit about what that approach looks like. We've banned the words pros and cons. We don't like using the words pros and cons when talking about technology because con implies it's bad and it doesn't work or there's something wrong with it. So we don't like to use the word con. Instead, we want to say constraints. To me, constraints is much more proactive. What does this tool allow us to do? And what do we have to consider when using it? Rather than just, nah, it doesn't work because X, Y, and Z. So walking down these series of questions again, what are the affordances that a tool provides us? So when you're in that evaluation stage and you're thinking, what tool, what affordances does it allow you to do? It goes back to that kind of applying that TPK or that TPACK piece. What does the technology allow us to do to enhance the learning or enhance the content? Again, what are the constraints of the tool? Not why won't it work, but what do I have to consider when using this? Why might I not want to use this for this objective? The other piece that's important is to say, what will my students need to know in order to use this tool? If you're bringing a tool for the first time to the table, there's going to be some front loading that has to be done with that, potentially for them to be successful, especially if it becomes more complex. We used to use the example with our teachers who might be looking to blog with a kid or have a kid go on a blog. And the reality was, we said, no wonder these kids are confused. Not only do they, have trouble with their writing because they're using a new skill there, but they're also using a new tool. So you're doing two things at once that are brand new to kids. So if you can identify that kids will need certain skills to be successful using a tool, you can front load those pieces so that you can be more successful when you actually get to that implementation piece. So a good example is, again, if you're talking about blogging, or maybe you want kids to be on Twitter, and that's an important piece. Starting with those non-technical activities, especially if you have limited access, starting with non-technical activities to build their capacity to use the tool. So if you're talking about Twitter, you have a 140 character limit. Get kids in the habit of writing 140 characters, get them exposed to hashtags and how do you actually use Twitter before they get on that tool so that they can be successful. And you can apply that approach to pretty much any tool. That there are things that you can kind of front load that may help them be successful. Again, the other part is, what will you need to know? What resources will you need? So it's important that as you look to use those tools, maybe you have the foundational knowledge, but maybe you don't know what you don't know. So the question is, who do you ask? And hopefully there's someone in your building or a resource that you can tap into. But it's a good reminder to talk to those people. They love to help. Hopefully, but it is an opportunity to kind of take a step back and what will you know? Again, what will you need to front load? And then ultimately, how do these tools impact what you want students to learn? And again, that's thinking about that TPACK piece. How will it change the learning? How will it improve the learning? So if we balance those affordances and constraints, here are just some examples of Google Docs. It's a little dated, but they're mostly this kind of apply. And the affordances that people thought of with Google Docs or Google Drive was, this is something that's available to home and school. So if they had limited access at school, but they could go on at home, that was a positive. That was an affordance of using that tool over something like Microsoft Word. You have multiple tools in one spot, multiple apps. You have your Sheets, your Drive. And then they really valued that collaborative tool as a collaboration tool. And again, going back to what does the learning look like? If that's your affordance and that's what your objective is, then it's a really good tool. If you wanted people to work individually, having a collaborative tool as an affordance really doesn't mean anything. So it's just it's a way to kind of evaluate that piece. And some of the constraints is that, they need logins, and maybe you're in a position where you can't get the logins for kids or they don't have access, and those would be constraints. There also may be some training that needs to happen before you get started. So that's just walking through kind of weighing that affordances and constraints, and what that process would look like. If we take it a step further, let's look at actually starting with a standard and a learning objective, and saying that in second grade, the students should participate in a shared research and writing project. And so the objective would be that, students will research the culture of the people in China in small groups, and they'll write short paragraphs comparing and contrasting the Chinese culture with their own. And so I decided that, I need either a resource, or I need a book, or I need something for that research piece. So taking that same objective and saying, on one hand, I'm going to have groups using an eyewitness China book. Well, I'll have another group that may just go on and do a Google search. And if you think about what would happen in those situations, or if you think about the affordances and constraints, and we're looking at the eyewitness books, we might say that the chances are the content in that book would be grade appropriate or pretty darn close, or at least we would know that going in. We would know that, again, it's going to be pretty condensed. They're not going to have a ton of information in front of them, that they should be able to find that information relatively easy. Obviously, if you're looking at the Google side in the affordances, they would have an opportunity to find a wide variety of information. They may find more primary sources that specifically speak to the culture of China. If you look at those constraints, though, on the book side, again, you might be limited in materials, limited resources. You may find that, again, the type of the information that's found is is very convergent knowledge. Everybody's going to arrive at the same answer. So is that part of what you want the learning to look like? Whereas with Google, they would have the opportunity to be more divergent. They would find different information and bring that back. So again, thinking about what that learning looks like is important when you're using those, evaluating those affordances and constraints. Alternately, again, with Google, some of those resources are going to be way too hard and probably not appropriate. So it's that balance between understanding what your objective is. I would say if I wanted everybody to have the same information about China, I'd probably use a book. If there was one central point about that I wanted everybody to get, I would use the same resource. But if I was really wanting them to participate in research projects, that they had some experience with research before, that it wasn't new, then I might choose a more open-ended tool to kind of see what they would get. So it's just that inner monologue of being able to think through that process. There are both affordances and constraints to both of those tools. It just depends on what that objective is. So again, going back and thinking of that experience and rethinking about those affordances and constraints. This being just a really powerful evaluation tool in terms of determining, what tool to use in the class. And again, thinking about how it's going to impact the learning and how it's going to affect kids. So I want to end that piece of the presentation, and I'm going to see if I can bounce back to my screen here. I don't know how to do that, so I'll assume you guys, I have to stop the share. There we go. Now we're back.
Thank you very much, Mark. Does anybody have any questions or comments for Mark? I know that you had a comment earlier, Marcy, about what your understanding was about blooms. Is it still the same?
Yeah, I'm just wondering if it's if this model is kind of the same as the Bloom's model, just integrating the technology piece into it.
That's interesting. I think you can take it. I think you could take it both ways. I think as you look at the integration pieces and you look at the type of learning, the ultimate goal would be probably to get to that higher level thinking. So as a teacher might be unfamiliar with technology, maybe that expectation would be that they wouldn't necessarily be looking at those higher level skills. But in terms of a coaching piece, if I were working with the teacher and coaching them, our goal would always be to work towards those higher level thinking skills as a goal. Does that kind of make sense?
Does anybody else have any other questions? Amelia, did you have a comment?
No, I was just saying, I was thinking about limited devices, as a tech coach, how would you, start off with, maybe one for 20 kids?
Right. To me, I would always go back to some of it preparing that they may have access at some point. In some way, shape, or form, whether it be one device in a classroom or a lab type setting or at home, and that whatever you could do to make the skill, whatever you could do in a non-technical way to make those skills transferable. So we were talking about the Twitter example. That's a skill you can use that. You wouldn't get all the benefits of Twitter, but you can teach that skill so that if you do have that opportunity, that they get that chance and they would have that knowledge. So I'd always keep in the back of my mind, if I did anticipate using tools and I knew that I had limited access or limited time, what could I do to start building those skills ahead of time so that they would at least be successful with limited access, or that they could be successful in more of an independent, whether it be out of school or a personal device or what have you, that you're still building skills to do that. I would say the reality of doing whole class projects is probably, it's pretty limiting at that point if you only have a few devices. So could it be something that's done as more of a center but / like collaborative? Those would be ways that I would look at it. I know it's not always ideal, but I think the more you could do to kind of build those skills for readiness and fluency, it'll help when they're actually at that point to use it.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone else?
I just have one. I think the biggest thing is, we get trained to do lots of wonderful things like this, and as teachers, we're certainly capable of doing that. But I think the stumbling block for me is the time that goes into all the planning, because this is only a small portion of what we're required to do. So, I would love someone to do a training on how to find the time, and so I don't know if you've worked with teachers that have gotten good at coming up with something that they can use to jump off of for other things, so that the planning time is not so intense. I mean, I can do lots of things, but I have a prep time of 40 minutes, which I have to then, make sure that students have what they need, contact parents, do what the principal wants. And I have a teenage daughter that's very active. I don't want to miss that. So then it's midnight, and I haven't done anything like this that I've been trained to do. So I'm just wondering, in your setting, have you seen a teacher that's done a really good job of coming up with an efficient way?
I would say yes and no. I would say what we identified a couple of years ago, about 4 or 5 years ago, in our K-8 was from an administrative or professional development side. It was really important for us to pick tools that we could say, these are focus tools. So we developed what we call focus tools, and we carved out some meeting times for it. And we just had to make it a priority. And we said, well, we're going to pick 3 tools as a school that everybody's going to know. And there's criteria to those tools. They have to be highly flexible. They should be used in multiple areas, affordable, accessible. Everybody should be able to use it, and they should be flexible enough that you can use them. And we developed some capacity in terms of using those tools. What ended up happening is that everybody kind of developed fluency in those tools. There wasn't an expectation saying, you know what, you don't have to master every tool out there. But through our meeting times, through some of our faculty meetings, we can model some lessons, we could share some experiences, and by just focusing on a few things and saying, again, if you want to do something else, great, but to your point, you don't have the time. And so if we could make just a little bit of time to say, we're going to learn these, and we're going to give you some basic training, in a decent way, that through your plan time, you can fall back on those tools. You would have that capacity. You would know how those tools would work, and then the planning would become easier. Or we build in those sharing opportunities, because what would drive me nuts is sitting in a faculty meeting and somebody wants to share something and looking around and seeing like half the people have no idea what they're talking about. I just found Kahoot. Well, what? Great, but nobody understood what that meant, and so it was lost. But by just saying we're going to look at just a couple tools, or maybe a couple types of tools, student response systems, something, actually a good not, I think it's Quick Key, one of those tools that kind of there's a couple formative assessment tools for non-technical environments with limited computers that gives you some of those formative assessment beats. You know, just developing fluency around those tools helps some of that planning time. Because the reality is, I mean, time is finite. You either have it or you don't. And, you know, there are a lot of demands and expectations. So I always look at what, from my responsibility, how can we make that easier? So that's helped. You know, the teachers who are successful integrating, they just put in that time, and we're thankful that they spend that time, because, you know, maybe they don't have anything else going. I don't know. But they can usually, but then come back to those common planning times with ideas that everybody understands. There's not that explaining going on. That's a really long answer, but does that kind of give some help, or just some ideas?
I just have an iPad in my hands for the first time March. And so I am very excited about that. I teach kindergarten. And so I was able to gather lots of iPads from teachers that didn't want to do that. But I found it to be very overwhelming because I'm only one step ahead of them. And I think I had, you know, like things figured out, and we were in the midst of this really great thing. And oh gosh, Adobe needs a login. And so I guess what I was hoping, and you did say that, is that as I become savvy, it will be easier for me and there'll be less upfront time because I will just have that knowledge. So planning will come faster. Is that what you were saying?
Yeah, and I definitely think there's some, I don't want to say validity, but I definitely think there's some, in terms of the three pieces, like I could say, like I could generically say there's three things you just need to know about every tool that you use. How to get started. So do they need to log in? If you don't know it, at least it gives you a place to start asking questions or do research, so that you're not saying, well, how do I use this? You know, you don't need to know all the bells and whistles. How do you get started with it? So your point, like a kid needing a login, that derails a lesson. I mean, it could be kind of catastrophic.
I logged in, you know, I didn't know, like we had used it in class, and you know, I didn't know because they logged in, and we all sat down, and it came up login, and I was like, you know, and you're right, then you blow it, and the kids are, you know, a mess.
Yeah, so been there, done that. I've made that mistake plenty of times. So kind of learning from that, I always say I need to know before I ever look at a tool, how do kids get started, especially with younger kids. How do you undo something? So I mean, again, you always need a generic idea of how the app works or how it should be your objective. So that's assuming that's already taken place. But how do you undo something so that if a kid makes a mistake, how can you either fix it or how can they fix it independently? And then the third part is, how do you share what's done? So if they're just going on doing skill and drill, that's fine. They don't really need to share anything unless you're anticipating getting some information back out of that. But if they're using a creative app or if they're using a creative tool, you know, how do you share? How do you get that out? I can't tell you how many times we've been in a lesson, somebody's made a video, great, but nobody knows what to do with it or where it goes. You know, does it go in a Dropbox at that point, or how do I get it on my website? And it just sits on the iPad. So in that case, I think those three things are generic and broad enough that if you just started with those questions before you use something, so that you're not wasting time trying to learn so much, if you can do that and have, you know, somewhat of a flexible mindset with kids, and again, depends on your kids and depends on your class. But if you go into it and let them know, guys, this may be messy a little bit, we have to be flexible, but you have those three pieces, you're going to be more successful than not. That's just kind of my experience.
All right, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions? Okay, let me just turn off the recording for a second, Mark. I know, but I can't work backwards.